You are listening to WSLR LP 96.5 FM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 FM in Bradenton.
This is show 43 of our Changing Environment, and it's being recorded on September 3rd, 2024. The previous show was Corduroy, hosted by Sebastian.
I'm Julie Morris.
I'm Jono Miller, and we're assisted today by Alvaro Montalegre.
Our guest today is Steve Suau. Steve has 40 years of experience dealing with local hydrologic challenges. He is a former director of Sarasota County's Stormwater Environmental Utility and has been involved in numerous watershed restoration projects, including the Celery Fields and the Donna Bay Watershed Restoration and Management Plan.
The views, comments, and opinions that come from our interviews, shows, on-air personalities, and from our calling guests are uncensored, and those views and opinions can be widespread and extremely diverse. The opinions or views expressed by SAME do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of WSLR, our staff, or volunteers.
Steve, this is our first show after Tropical Storm Debby, and also it became Hurricane Debby, and we're honored to have you here to talk about the history of flooding in Sarasota County and how the county has responded to that over decades.
Good morning, Julie. Jono.
Hi. Well, so let's start. What would be a good working definition of flooding?
Water where you don't want it.
Yeah, exactly.
From a wise person.
That's right. So we've had, and so something that's worth reflecting on is the earliest, European or American settlers here settled on the highest land. They settled on Sandpine Community, and where downtown Sarasota is. There was high land, Sandpine and Englewood. There was longleaf pine out in Old Myakka. So the first settlers, either by good luck or probably common sense, avoided areas that were subject to flooding.
Yeah, that's true.
It's no mistake when you see Bee Ridge Road, Lockwood Ridge Road, that those were built on the high ground.
Uh-huh. Yeah, people must wonder where that ridge terminology came from, because our topography overall seems pretty flat, but the fact is there are dividing lines. So maybe you could talk about what's a watershed and what's a basin.
Well, they can be used interchangeably,
Okay.
frankly, but a watershed is typically a defined area where all the rain that may fall within that area drains to a certain water body. Could be the bay, could be a lake, could be a river, but for example, the Myakka River watershed would be all the land where rainfall that falls on it drains into Charlotte Harbor from the Myakka River and its tributaries.
Okay, and so we have a number of watersheds inside the county. The Myakka is the easternmost. Then it seems like along the bays we have some smaller creek watersheds. And then that leaves the Philippi Creek watershed and the Cowpen Slough watershed. Is that about it?
Yeah, there's about 16 coastal watersheds that are served by probably historically just tidal creeks that have all been drained and connected to wetlands. Philippi Creek and Cowpen Slough being the largest of those 16.
So in Hurricane Ian, we had a tremendous amount of rainfall, and that primarily affected Northport and the southern part of the county, whereas in Debby it was sort of the opposite, a lot of rainfall, and the major effects seemed like they were felt in the northern part of the county. Is that true?
Yeah, so, when we talk about these 100-year storms, they're also, it's dependent on where the rain falls. So from what I remember, the rain that fell on Myakka River and Peace River kind of out east resulted in some of the highest flooding that has ever been recorded since they've kept records since 1939 on Myakka River. So, and that affected Northport in the same way.
So that was in Ian, right?
That was for Ian, yeah. But on Debby, those areas didn't get as much rainfall. Philippi Creek and portions of west Sarasota County got a lot of rainfall, probably the 100-year or greater during Debby.
So I looked at the records for Myakka River in Debby, and the Myakka River came up 5 feet in Debby, but it came up 5 feet over 5 days. And so the people that live along the Myakka River know that when they see the flood elevations upstream increasing, they know that they're going to have flooding, but they have several days in order to adapt. I think that part of the problem in the Philippi Creek watershed was that the water arrives much faster. It's flashier, and water comes up before people have a chance to adapt.
So,
Right.
in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, there were a number of flooding events in the Philippi Creek Basin, and that was partially because by that time the basin had been channelized and drained to manage high water levels, both for agriculture and for residential development. And so that meant that a lot of the rainfall that was falling on the Philippi Creek watershed was being delivered to the downstream in a very rapid manner, in contrast to what happens in the Myakka River. And so a lot of water coming downstream, and that was because they channelized all of the wetlands that used to be holding back water in the prior agricultural development period. And can you explain that process to us?
Yes, I mean, Florida had an obsession with they called it land reclamation at the time, but it was basically to drain the land so that it could be primarily farmed. And Philippi Creek was no exception. There was a drainage district that was actually set up through the state called the Sarasota Fruitful Drainage District. And they deepened Philippi Creek, which historically was just a meandering coastal creek that came up to about where Bobby Jones is now and stopped. That was deepened, and like you said, Julie, they connected the dots being all the wetlands, and connected them to all drain into Philippi Creek. Some of the most significant areas were Bobby Jones, the celery fields, and kind of what I call the eastern celery fields, which used to drain to Cowpen Slough. And those were converted because of the organic muck soils to rich agricultural vegetable growth at the time. But that resulted in flooding. The thing is that even if you drain those areas, if you get enough rainfall, Mother Nature knows where to go, and those areas will fill up.
They're still low.
They're still low, and in the landscape, and so if you get enough rain, they'll get filled again. You may be able to keep them dry normally, but they'll fill up, and that's the same with if you build homes in those areas, they'll be susceptible to flooding if you get enough rain.
Yeah, what I realized is it's not what elevation you're at, it's whether somebody's at a higher elevation.
Yeah.
And so, if there's enough water. And, we should talk a little bit about the 100-year storm, but you need to keep in mind there's a 500-year storm and a 1,000-year storm. I think the outer perimeter in the Netherlands is designed for the 10,000-year storm.
You mean the dikes in the Netherlands?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they have a lot of invested, but we could pick any standard that the county wanted to pick. We could design to that standard. So talk a little bit about this. What we keep hearing about the 100-year flood.
Yeah. So what determines the 100-year flood is looking at historical records of what's happened over a period, and it's looked at with statistically to see what has a probability of occurring. The federal government is the one that pretty much sets a standard at 100 years storm, which means it has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And that's based upon risk-first investment, trying to balance that. The state of Florida, pretty much the Water Management District and, I think all the water management districts and most municipalities use what's called the 25-year storm to design infrastructure. But they do rely on the federal government 100-year flood elevations for setting finished floor elevations to keep people up and out of that. Sarasota County is the only municipality that I'm aware of that uses the 100-year storm, not just for setting finished floors, but for designing infrastructure. And that's been the case for probably 20 to 25 years. However, those standards, those statistical analysis based on historical rainfall records have not been updated in probably 25, 30 years. And so it doesn't capture the whole history of rainfall events. If you start incorporating that, I think, and there have been some entities, NOAA has done a update in 2013, which is now over 10 years old. I think the University of Central Florida has done one, as well as recently South Florida Water Management District, indicating that those, the 100-year storm, for example, is probably 20% or so more rainfall than what it was previously. So a discussion about what is a 100-year rainfall probably needs to happen at the state and local level, but particularly the state.
So Sarasota County uses the SWIFMUD, the Southwest Florida Water Management District 100-year flood prediction, and that hasn't been updated since like the 1990s. Is that right?
Somewhere around there, right.
Okay.
But even if you kept, even if it remained the same, if you had one watershed and you paved it all, there would be more flooding with the same amount of rainfall, right?
Yeah, it would be much.
Right. So we have two
runoff.
different things going on. We have, if there's increasing number of storms or the storms have increasing amount of rain, that's going to affect the 100-year flood. But if you're just basing it on rainfall, that's one thing. It seems like you would also need to factor in the ability of the landscape to absorb water.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a little tricky because watersheds, even like the Myakka River, that are not they're not flashy. They take a long time for water to build up, and it takes a long time for it to come down.
Right.
Most of the coastal watersheds recover pretty quickly. But if you have rainfall over a week, the Myakka River is just one big mound of water. And at the end of the rainy season, there could be very little storage available. The wetlands are full, the water table is up.
Right.
So it's almost like having an impervious
Yes, right.
basin, but it's so flat that and natural that it's still kind of sluggish in terms of how fast it can drain off. In the urban areas and suburban areas, development is required to manage their stormwater typically with stormwater ponds, and the objective is, one of the objectives anyway, is to hold water back so that they don't release it faster than it was beforehand, and to make sure that they're not impacting flood elevations outside of their property and increasing them. And that's what the design criteria for permitting requires, whether it's a 25-year storm for SWIFMUD or the 100-year design storm for Sarasota County.
So let me say, if our listeners are curious about the county's reaction, they can go back and listen to the two most recent county commission meetings. And if you've never done this before, you can simply search Google Sarasota County Commission. There'll come up a little menu on the left side of the screen that says Watch County Commission Meetings, and there you'll see the 27th and 28th of the last month. Now, it doesn't actually say we're ever going to, the agenda doesn't mention Hurricane Debby. It just says Department Recovery Updates, and they're the first thing on the agenda for those 2 days. And if you watch those, you'll see Spencer Anderson, who is head of
Public Works.
And he says, well, we design our systems to accommodate 10 inches in 24 hours. And what drives me crazy about that is what you were talking about. It's not like there's a reset button that after 24 hours you go back to zero. You're left with the accumulated water that's fallen previously. So I would think if you had 9 inches in a 24-hour period and then had 4 inches the next day, you'd be in worse shape than if you were starting in a drought and then had 11 inches the following day. And so why is it that the standards can't accommodate or incorporate the antecedent conditions?
Well, the criteria does require an antecedent condition of what they call average antecedent moisture condition. But there's also a condition where it's dry or extremely wet. So you're right. That's criteria that could be adjusted. The other thing is looking at a longer duration storm. The South Florida Water Management District, for example, uses a 3-day 25-year storm.
Yeah.
And for large watersheds that can't recover quickly, that's probably more appropriate. A lot of the smaller urban watersheds, they can get overwhelmed real quick from a lot of rain, very intense rain, even in an hour in flood, but they recover quickly. And so what we saw, for example, in 1992, when we had that big flood event, was a lot of the urban areas were able to recover because the storm stopped in between each day, and they were able to come down pretty quickly. As where the Maca River, you never saw any recovery. It just kept coming up and up and up. It just couldn't drain off fast enough. So recovery is kind of was back in the 60s when they were draining everything. That was probably the biggest thing they were trying to do, is get the watersheds to recover quickly by draining off faster, and so they would be available for the next rainfall event. But you could look at a longer duration storm to address that kind of thing.
Yeah, because the biggest problem you're going to have is when the system is already saturated, and then even a small rainfall event is going to be more problematic.
We looked at the Sarasota records of rainfall for the 3 days prior to Debby on August 4th, and it was 1.9 inches of rain at the airport. And I don't know how the county. You were saying that the South Florida looks at the 3 days prior, but that I don't know how the county incorporates that prior 3 or 4 days of rain in their model.
To clarify, the South Florida Water Management District has a design storm that is a 3-day storm, 72 hour, not 24 hours. So you're considering the rainfall over that entire 72 hours. So, that may be more appropriate. In the case of Debby, I've looked at the rainfall records, and I would say that storm started on the 3rd of August. Like you said, you got about an inch and a half, 2 inches of rain. Then it kind of stopped, and then it started again within about 12 hours. So you could adjust based upon that to a more wet antecedent moisture condition, and therefore you're going to get more runoff. The best thing to do, though, is probably, and this is what I'm sure will be done, is that storm will be modeled as it occurred. It wasn't a 24-hour event. It occurred over about a 72-hour period. The most intense part of it happened over 24 hours, but it produced more than just that. It produced like you said, about an inch and a half prior to it really coming down, and it probably produced another inch or so after it kind of started to stop. So the thing to do would be to look at that rainfall event within the computer models that the county has. The output of the computer models is only as good as the rainfall that you put in. And so you have to, if you want to see what happened in Debby, you can't look at a theoretical storm. You actually have to model that storm. And fortunately, Sarasota County collects a lot of data on rainfall and how high water gets in certain strategic locations. So there's a lot of really good data available to look at and analyze to see what happened and how high things got, and see if you can simulate that with a model.
So let's talk about the celery fields and how it was redesigned to mitigate stormwater in Philippi Creek Basin. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that's why it was That's why it was purchased by the county. So, I'll tell you the story because I heard some things last week that probably should be clarified. And I remember being around as on the advisory committee for the county for the stormwater program. I think it was at the time Commissioner Anderson is the one that came up with the idea that it would be great if the county had a revenue source to manage stormwater. So he requested, and he got a number of commissioners to agree to have staff and legal department look at setting up a stormwater utility, a way to generate revenue to manage stormwater. And what happened was we had a flood almost right after they had finished that study in June of 1992, and it was a big one. It was probably comparable to what we saw with Debby in Philippi Creek, and residents from Colonial Oaks and Colonial Gables and the Pinecraft area in particular attended commission meetings demanding something be done, and the county had an ordinance and a program sitting there ready to implement. So that gave them the ability to kind of pull the trigger and create this stormwater utility as a result of that flood, which is what generated the revenue to purchase the celery fields. And that was purchased with the intent of converting it back into a stormwater holding area. It had been drained, as previously mentioned, for agriculture. The agricultural operations had come kind of to the end of their rope with it. They were going to sell. It was designated for, I think, major employment center, but the county wisely acquired it to recreate the ability to hold stormwater in there and try to address some of the downstream flooding. So all of that kind of fatefully came together right about the same time.
Okay, and so people think of the celery fields as a bird watching and recreation area, but it's actually a stormwater management and attenuation area. And it's managed by stormwater, not Parks and Rec.
That's correct, yeah.
And so what did the county do in the celery fields to reach this goal of managing stormwater for the Philippi Creek Basin?
So they, in addition to acquiring it, which was a big deal, they kind of, quote, undrained it. The large canals that were constructed in the area to drain the land were diverted back into the celery fields so that they would hold water. And the celery fields themselves were reshaped to hold more water. The northern part were excavated into lakes. The middle part and the southern part were regraded to be more wetland. But at the end of the day, it holds more water, and water is diverted into it. So there's also water quality benefits from doing that, but that have been documented. But the main thing is to hold more water in it. The county did the same thing, by the way, I was involved in when I was a stormwater director in Donna Bay. There's a large area there, and that's probably a couple times bigger than celery fields even, and hopefully that'll be open to the public at some point as well as a birding and nature park as well. But almost identical, a big canal constructed by the federal government to drain Cowpen Slough and divert it away from the Myakka River into Donna Bay. That canal will be diverted, and as I think it already has been diverted back into the former swamp that has been regraded, and they're storing water in there. And I'm sure there's water quality improvements, but also reflooding the natural area there that had been drained. In that case, it was drained. Citrus was planted. A dike was put up. Pumps were put in. But what they found out was when you got enough rain, you just can't overcome all the water that was on the citrus. So they sold it to the county. I was at the county at the time when that grove was acquired, and it's part of the old slough, part of the old wetland like the celery fields that was then reconverted into a water holding area and a habitat wetland area.
So you said earlier that the celery fields was not originally part of the Philippi Creek watershed, that it kind of tapered out. The Philippi Creek watershed tapered out at Bobby Jones Golf Course. In order to get access to those muck soils to grow celery, they connected the basin that has become the celery fields to the Philippi Creek watershed?
Yeah, I it's hard to imagine, but 150 years ago, before all that drainage was put in, systems out east like the celery fields would have expanded in the wet season, probably out into the pine flatwoods, very shallow. The mosquitoes would have been unbelievable, and then it would contract as we got into the dry season, and may have gone close to being dry. But it just had a natural, like an accordion, expanding and contracting on the landscape. If it got up high enough, if you had, one of these severe rainfall events, it may have popped off and sheet flowed downstream somewhere, and it may eventually got into the celery fields. But that would have probably been fairly rare that water, all the fresh water out there on the landscape, actually made its way into the bay. Those canals that were cut have dramatically changed the fresh water, not just during a flood, but for any rainfall event, and seasonally. The amount of fresh water that's been going into our bays and estuaries has dramatically changed as a result of all the drainage that occurred in 100 years or so ago.
Yeah, I think Sarasota Bay used to be have a higher salinity than it does now, and because of all of the drainage that connects to the coast, it's fresher than it used to be.
Yeah, there was the original. I don't know if it was original Molten Marine, but one of the original research centers for studying estuaries and water was down in Lemon Bay, called the Bass Lab, and some of the records down there from the 40s, which would be before the intercoastal and all the mosquito control ditching down in that area, showed that the kind of species like sawtooth fish, I think, and I'm not a biologist, but what I've been told is a lot of those species could not exist. They need salt, a lot of salinity to exist. They couldn't exist today based on the fresh water levels. So yeah, I'm sure it's had a dramatic effect on the flora and fauna in the estuaries.
Members of the community who are still recovering from Hurricane Debby are encouraged to utilize Sarasota County's multi-agency resource center located at 2923 Ashton Road. It is open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day through Friday, August 16th. Individuals who need transportation to the resource center should call 311. The following agencies and organizations are on site: SRQ Strong, American Red Cross, Bay Legal Services, Local Relief, Salvation Army, Career Source of Pasco, Hernando, and Career Source of Suncoast, Florida Licensing on Wheels, Florida Commerce, Florida Health, Department of Business and Professional Regulation, Citizens Property Insurance, Agency for Persons with Disabilities, Agency on Aging, Hope, Florida, and Capacity Path Relief. More information at scgov.net. And this is WSLR. You're listening to WSLR LP 96.5 FM in Sarasota and WBPV 100.1 FM in Bradenton.
So, Steve, I assume you watched those two commission meetings?
Yep,
yeah,
I did.
So they were trying to brief the county commission on the county's response. And, naturally they focused on areas where there were problems. Like we've been talking about the Cowpen Slough system. I haven't heard any big complaints about that. And the Mayaca rises pretty slowly. It seemed like most of the concern was centered on the Philippi Creek Basin. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's where most of the rain fell.
Yeah.
Let's see. Could we continue talking about the celery fields and how it performed in this particular rainfall event from Debby, associated with Debby?
I think that again, the county collects a lot of data, and in real time, it looks like the water, to put it simply, I think the Surrey Fields probably overperformed. Water was, the county's able to hold water back in the Surrey Fields by closing off its outfall. That there's big man-made weir and gates that are closed, and it looks like water was stacked up probably a couple feet higher than the highest elevation even planned. So quite a bit of water was held up back in the Surrey Fields, and having not just areas like that, but keeping those areas from getting developed, I think, is really important. One of the things that I'll mention is that years ago, back in '92, after that flood, the county did a map of they mapped all the problem areas of flooding from that flood, and they found that a large area in the middle of the county, corresponding to the Palmer Ranch, didn't have any problems. And I had, at the time, was working with the Palmer Ranch, and we developed these really sophisticated and, at the time, state-of-the-art models to evaluate everything that ever happened to make sure that flood elevations didn't change downstream or upstream. And so it got away from the presumptive criteria that's typically used in permitting that says if you don't increase the peak rate of flow after development than what it was before, it's presumed that you won't have an impact. These sophisticated models were able to actually demonstrate that that's the case. And so after that experience, I went to the Public Works Director and said, you could do this for the whole county. And that's what we worked on doing. And having those sophisticated models, and I'll say all models are wrong, some are useful, which means no model is perfect, but they can help tell you and potentially predict things. And if they get it right and provide more benefit than not, they're useful. And I think Sarasota County having that kind of tool has been and will continue to be useful. Looking at what this rainfall, if you use the rainfall that occurred in Debby, as we talked about, to drive that model, it will probably do a pretty good job of predicting what happened. In most cases, there were some anomalies, I think, but a lot of the areas that have problems are areas that were built in low areas, like down at Pinecraft and whatnot. And one of the things we can learn, and I learned, working with the Palmer Ranch, they had so much land that one of the first things we did was map all the floodplain. And before any roads or development was planned, we knew where the floodplains were, we knew where the threatened and endangered species were, the archaeological sites, the wetlands, the other protected habitats, and that's planning. And I would say that it would probably be beneficial for the community to really consider flood-prone areas more seriously when they're looking at increasing densities and putting houses in those areas. Fortunately, the county didn't do it in the Surrey Fields. They bought it. Same with Cowpen Slough, the old slough they've purchased. Those areas really need to be set aside. It's not that you can't do any development of floodplain. You could along maybe the fringe, but the large areas really are important to try to keep that way, or enhance even if you can, and rehydrate. And there's more benefits than just flood control. As I mentioned, there's water quality and there's habitat, where all the wildlife comes back, and all you really have to do is add water back into these systems, and the wildlife are there within probably months. The Surrey Fields, when I was at the county, when I was a director of Stormwater, Sarasota Audubon came to me and said, hey, we're getting a lot of bird species back in the system. Can we help manage it? And we worked out where they could be a partner in that, and they've been a great partner in managing the Surrey Fields for wildlife. So there's many benefits to protecting those areas.
And we are, all three of us recognize that the old soil surveys indicate where the frequently flooded soils are, and that is a really important factor when you're doing this planning exercise of identifying where the floodplains are.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because using those historical indicators and identifying where all those large old sloughs, and many of them have drained, but they're still there on the landscape. And that's not just Sarasota County. I've done a lot of work across Southwest Florida. I'd say every county in Southwest Florida has 2 or 3 of those significant signatures that are out there. They've been drained, converted to agriculture, but they're still out there. And the good news is, what I'm seeing is a lot of them are being reconverted back, either through the same federal agency that drained Cowpen Slough now has a wetland reserve program, and they're acquiring easements and rehydrating areas up like at Tatum Sawgrass and down at Fish Eating Creek area. But yeah, there's those areas are out there, and they can be easily restored by just adding water to them, basically.
Just add water.
Yeah.
So do we know? Could the celery fields have held more water, or was it maxed out in Debby?
There's potential, I think, for it to hold more water. I don't know. I think you reach a point of diminishing return, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Because water does not back up into the celery fields from downstream. It's low, but it's perched up above the areas on the west side of the interstate. So there's probably a limitation to how much benefit you could get out of storing water there. But there is land in the celery fields itself that is higher than where the water level is normally at. So obviously, and I'm saying, maybe 2, 3, 4 feet higher, if you were to excavate that area out, and it's mainly in the central cell where the big mountain is, you could get more storage in there, and you could create more wetland habitat at the same time. So there's probably some potential for additional storage, but I think you'd have to look at is there enough benefit at all to justify it?
So we watched the presentation to the county, and it seemed like there was a lot of focus on the Weather Service.
Yeah, they were blaming the Weather Service for predicting only 6 to 8 inches of rainfall, and if it had been 10 or less, everything would have performed perfectly, they were saying. But because the Weather Service didn't predict the intensity and the amount of rainfall, they were blaming, maybe defensively, the county's EOC staff was blaming the Weather Service for not adequately warning them that there would be 18 inches of rain.
Well, so my question is, what would the county have done differently if the National Weather Service said we're going to have 18 inches of rain? They could have opened more shelters, but if they managed the celery fields properly and they managed, there's a weir or something on Shackett Creek or Cowpen. Mm-hmm. If they did that properly, what could they have conceivably done differently that would have kept water, kept the levels lower? It's not obvious they could have done anything.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. I don't. I mean, I presume there is protocol for what to do, and there should be documentation of what happened in terms of closing weirs, turning on pumps, that kind of thing. But I haven't seen that.
They did discuss. The county has, through experience, identified what they call hot spots, where there's known problems either with debris accumulating. And I guess we should talk a little about the different ways in which flooding occurs. I mean, one is when you have a ditch or conveyance and it gets blocked somehow and backs up, that creates a problem. The other, if you monkey around with the basin divides, and all of a sudden, I think when they, when you modify a basin so that it's much larger than what the system was designed for, that can be an issue. So, it would be interesting to go back. I just don't know. It would be interesting to see what they think they would have done differently if there'd been a prediction for 18 inches of rain.
Yeah, I think the county is planning and would be wise to look at kind of a postmortem evaluation of how things were done. And I was surprised myself by how much rain came with Debby. It was just a constant band.
Yeah.
I'm down near Nokomis, and it just never stopped. But that's what can happen. And when you mobilize for a flood, you're mobilizing for a flood, like you're saying, Jono. I think what you're going to do is what you're going to do. I would anticipate. It might be good to clarify too, for folks how that are looking at, do I need flood insurance? Where do I go to learn, even if I'm told I don't? And I think that probably the most authoritative source are the federal insurance rate maps or the FEMA maps. And what they do is they will determine both the flooding that occurs along the coast from a storm surge, from a hurricane. So it's not rainfall based. It's based on the Gulf of Mexico coming in and inundating things. And again, that's called storm surge. And then they also determine flooding from rainfall, which is called riverine flooding. What happens is the storm surge, which is really high along the coast, as you move inland, starts to come down. Rainfall flooding, on the other hand, goes up from the coastline. So there's a point where those two flood sources intersect. And if you are Gulfward of that line, your flooding finished floor flood insurance will be based upon the storm surge. If you are landward of that line, it will be determined. The finished floor elevation and flood insurance is determined by the rainfall flooding. So there are two different sources like that, and it is a little confusing. But that's what those maps show is actually the 100-year, which is, I believe, for the most part, based upon the county. Similar to the county models, the 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. So a lot of those maps were just updated and adopted, I think, back in March earlier this year.
So one of the effects of storm surge is that it blocks, like in Philippi Creek, if there's a high tide, it blocks the drainage by having this wall of surge between 2 and 4 feet in the mouth of Philippi Creek. And that you have to wait until the tide drops in order for the fresh water to escape downstream. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not a direct relationship, just the physics of it.
Mm-hmm.
If the flood elevation from rainfall is probably the same regardless of tide level. Mm-hmm. If you get up far enough in the watershed, maybe a mile or two. It probably doesn't change much. It's just the physics of water. And so if water is draining down into a bowl, the Gulf of Mexico, as long as you have enough elevation to move down, you'll fill that area up more. But it won't. By the time you get up to like where the celery fields is, it's probably not susceptible to tide unless the tide was, unless it was a storm surge of 25 feet or 25 feet or something. Mm-hmm. But normally it's probably not affected by tide. Mm-hmm. So there is some influence, but you lose it as you get up a mile or two, probably upstream.
So does the county actually have maps that the county's generated that shows what they think that 1% chance map looks like?
Yeah, so that's what is also, I think, made things confusing. The county, I worked on this 25 years ago, has developed maps for the entire county with the 100-year floodplain, the 10 inches and whatnot. We did that 25 years ago. The objective was to basically move those maps into FEMA so whether it's the county or you're looking at the FEMA maps, it's the same thing.
Okay.
That has taken, for some reason, a very long time. And Cowpen Slough and the Myakka River, the largest basins in the county, are still not reflected. The county's floodplains are still not reflected on the FEMA maps. Now, the county has been using their more detailed and accurate flood information for decades. But it's confusing, particularly if you live in Cowpen Slough or the Macker River. If you look at the FEMA maps, a lot of the area is shown to not be in the floodplain, and we know better from both experience and from the county maps reflect a lot of it. They reflect where all the water is, where you don't want it out there. So at some point, I think that is still the objective, to make sure that the county floodplain maps and the federal FEMA maps are the same.
And is there someplace online that the public can access the county's maps?
That's a good question. When I've gone on the county website recently, it's easy to get to the FEMA maps.
Yeah,
but I don't know. That's a good question. How? I mean, as an engineer, I'm able to access their what's called the FTP site, which will download any of their models and maps that they have.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's available to the general public, and that's a really good question.
Now,
because they should be, because those really dictate.
Yeah. Well, people would want to know.
Yeah,
particularly
exactly.
So, and then not too long ago, another outfit called First Street started publishing maps of flooding. Do you have an opinion about those?
I'm vaguely familiar with them.
Yeah.
I've seen it, but I don't. I suspect it's if you don't have any information, it's better than nothing. But I suspect they're not as detailed or accurate as say what the county probably has.
Yeah, well, it'd be great if the public had access to the county's more detailed maps in the Cowpen and Myakka area.
Yes,
We should ask about that.
So historically, there have been a number of attempts to move water from either the Celery Fields or the Philippi Creek watershed into the Cowpen Slough watershed. And is it Tatum Ridge that separates those two watersheds?
Well, yeah, that's the historical ridge. That was an historical ridge. But when I mentioned the Sarasota Fruitville Drainage District back 100 years ago drained Philippi Creek, they crossed that ridge and dug a canal to connect what I will call, for lack of a better word, the eastern celery fields, another large area just like the celery fields that's east of Tatum Sawgrass, was in Cowpen Slough. It was ditched and drained to go west to Philippi Creek. And after a while, I think even that Philippi Creek drainage system for vegetable growth wasn't sufficient. So the federal government, in partnership with the county, I think dug Cowpen Slough, a big canal,
to drain that area for farming.
For farming, and it included a spurred-off canal called the Vegetable Relief Canal, and they planned to have a pump that would pump from Philippi Creek to that Vegetable Relief Canal that went into Cowpen Slough. So the plan was to divert water from Philippi Creek and the vegetable area into Cowpen Slough. That was all. Most of that work was completed, but it was not completely finished, and the pump was never installed. Before they finished, the people that lived down in Donna Bay, where all that water was being diverted, said, "Hey, you're destroying the estuary, the oyster population down here. You can't do anymore." The damage was already done, but it wasn't made any worse because they never installed a pump. And that is the reason for the Donna Bay restoration project, is to try to hold more water back and see if the oyster population, the salinity levels, cannot be increased to the point where the oyster population cannot get wiped out every year with all these slugs of fresh water that were being dumped into it.
So if I understand correctly, that's a multi-phase project, and the water ultimately would end up going into a shell pit that's east of the Myakka River, and then ultimately discharge into the Myakka. Is that right?
A portion of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it west of the Myakka River or east?
Yes, west.
West, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So
that shell pit, I was involved in acquiring that as well at the county, and we acquired that and leased it back to them to finish creating
Yeah.
the system. And it actually is strategically located in the area where Cowpen Slough used to flow east into the Myakka River. So, and that area still pretty much exists out there. So, getting water to go back that way and holding it, and that, you know, there's issues with flooding. And the other issue is once you get back into the Myakka River, not too far south of that is another canal called Blackburn Canal that drains it back to the bay to the west. So you can put the water back in Myakka River, but then you got another canal. So we talked about putting a weir or dam in Blackburn Canal to try to keep as much water, particularly during normal times, normal flows, in the Myakka River that as historically was there. So it's kind of undoing all the manipulations and diversions and dikes that have been done over the years.
You know what we say, a lot of today's problems are yesterday's solutions.
Right.
We've seen that with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Kissimmee River system, where they, did massive projects to channelize the Kissimmee, and now they do massive projects to unchannelize the Kissimmee. So it's interesting to see how these agencies' missions evolve.
And guess what costs more?
Yeah, well,
the restoration.
That's right. Yeah, and some of the stuff can't be restored. It was an elegant solution to take the Indian mounds and use them as road base. And now we wish we had the Indian mounds back so that we could understand these previous cultures, but they're all under asphalt somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, so I went to the county, one of the county buildings, and they have a glossy document in English and Spanish, and the headline is, "Anywhere it rains, it can flood." And it has advice for homeowners: find out what your flood hazard is. And maybe this is the address that they're giving. That's at AGS3, that's the numeral 3.scgov.net/SARCO-flood, which would be Sarasota County flood / So I don't know if those are the FEMA maps or the county maps. Then it says, buy flood insurance, stay safe, protect your property, raise your electrical system components, build responsibly, and protect natural floodplain functions. Keep swales and drainage ditches clear of debris to assure water flow. So that was what the county was distributing, at least prior to Debby.
So, Steve, what do you think going forward Sarasota County should do? Let's just recollect what you've already talked about in this conversation today. What would you summarize that Sarasota County should do in the future to prevent the events that were caused by the rainfall of Debby?
Yeah, well, they're not going to be able to prevent the weather, but I think there's a couple things, and one of them, from the discussions last week, it sounds like is definitely on the radar, and I think appropriately so, is a reconsideration of the design criteria based upon more recent rainfall records, to update that and look at what is, and using the best available information for maybe upping the design standards. I think that's definitely on the radar and needs to be. The second thing is probably a little more tricky, but the county has the data, and I think from a policy standpoint, they really should look at being much more cautious in increasing density in flood-prone areas. I think that's just planning 101, but staff has been presenting that information in their staff report if it's in the floodplain and whatnot. But we may have become kind of complacent as a community and thinking, oh, we haven't had a flood, it's never going to happen again. That happens again, and it will happen again. And so it's an opportunity to kind of look at particularly in the urban service boundary, looking at trying to figure out ways to prevent increasing density in these extremely flood-prone areas. And they're all mapped. We know where they are. It's just a matter of coming up with strategies. Maybe the stormwater program can even look at acquiring some of those like they did the Surrey fields to if they can hold more water and help reduce flooding elsewhere.
Well, and then I don't know if the county has a program like this, but there are, I think, maybe federal programs where if you're repeatedly flooded, there's sometimes opportunities to purchase those homes and get people out of harm's way.
Yeah, with the FEMA program. I mean, the county, all communities have to adopt the FEMA maps and an ordinance that commits them to administering basic minimum flood management standards. They have to do that to be eligible for the federal insurance program.
Yeah.
There's also credits, things they can do to get credits to reduce those insurance premiums, and one of those is to acquire open space property, particularly that is flood prone. So the county has a program for land acquisition. I know you're well into that, Jono, but there is a benefit and an incentive, if you will, in terms of reduced insurance premiums to put those areas that are most flood prone into public ownership.
Support for WSLR comes from community events like the Speak Your Truth Festival, happening Saturday, September 14th at Motorworks Brewing in Bradenton. This is an all-ages day of live music featuring headliners of Montreal and He Is Legend, along with dozens of other bands, over a dozen other bands. Doors open at 11:30. Music goes through 11:30 p.m. More information is available at speakyourtruthfestival.com. So my question is, the county designs these systems for the 10 inches in 24 hours, but I think that the next question is, well, what happens after that? Like when we're dealing in an 11-inch situation or a 17-inch system, what are people supposed to do? They moved into a subdivision that was engineered and designed to accommodate the 10 inches, but after that, there doesn't seem like there's any plan B, or, are you supposed to get on your roof, or what do you do? I remember with Katrina in New Orleans, there was a legend or a principle that you were supposed to keep an axe in your attic, and that when the floodwaters came up, you were supposed to take your axe and cut a hole in the roof so you could escape. But we don't really seem to have a plan B once we exceed the design standards.
Well, most systems are designed with the factor of safety and some freeboard. So, I mentioned the Palmer Ranch. They got just as much rain probably as Philippi Creek or close to it, and water levels probably came up higher than they anticipated. But in talking with them afterwards, they didn't have any home flooding. So there's usually additional elevation built into. Not in all cases. I think probably just like any profession, there's some engineers that design right to the edge, but most will design to make sure that there's a factor of safety in there, so that if you do get more than 10 inches, it doesn't mean that everything starts falling apart.
Well, we're running out of time. Thanks, Steve. We could talk for another hour.
You've been listening to Our Changing Environment on listener-sponsored WSLR LP Radio 96.5 FM, broadcasting from our downtown Sarasota studio on Kumquat Court.
Today's show, number 43, featured hydrologic engineer Steve Suau talking about flooding in the wake of Hurricane Debby.
Previous shows of Our Changing Environment may be accessed at the WSLR archives. Go to archive.wslr.org. WSLR.org.
If you'd like to be notified about upcoming shows, you can join the Facebook group Our Changing Environment.